So my name is Lorraine Gelsthorpe, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you on behalf of the Institute of Criminology, but particularly on behalf of the Justice and Society Research Centre, which hosts these annual lectures. If you're confused, it's because the Research Centre has changed its name from the Centre for Community, Gender and Social Justice to the Centre for the Justice and Society Research Centre. And this lecture is hosted by the Justice and Society lecture, but in partnership with the Probation Institute. And I have a triple privilege today in welcoming you as a member of the McWilliams Probation Lecture Steering Group, founding director of the Research Centre and current chair of the Probation Institute. So it gives me very great pleasure to welcome you all, old friends, new friends, family friends, professionals working in the world of criminal justice in general, but probation in particular, and a very warm welcome to probation trainees. We have a good number of probation officer trainees here today. Just on housekeeping, if you can remember to turn your mobile phone to silent or switch it off, please. We're not expecting a fire alarm, but if there is a fire alarm, there are exits and directions and they're all highlighted. And the toilets are right at the end of this level, right at the end if you turn right. So the Institute has long-standing and continuing interest in probation and community sanctions, and it's a particular delight each year to host this lecture. It's amazing in some ways that the lectures have continued into the 26th year from what began as a 5-year initiative started by some of Bill's colleagues, Brenda, his wife, and his family, including his sons, John and Carl, whom we particularly welcome today as well. So Bill McWilliams had a prestigious career as a probation practitioner, researcher, and writer, and he was a staunch advocate of the need for rigorous evaluation of probation practice and an equally staunch critic of the excesses of the management ideal. So the lectures began as an attempt to keep alive his critical spirit in relation to probation and community sanctions, but to do this in a constructive and forward-thinking fashion. So the considerable changes regarding probation in recent years make it imperative to continue the process of critical reflection. Never more so, I would say, in a context where the House of Lords Justice and Home Affairs Committee, in its Cutting Crime report, published in December 2023, advocates for better use of community penalties and highlights their effectiveness, as well as outlining some of the challenges. It's not at all clear where different political parties are intending to go with what I think is a groundbreaking report. Well, the lecture moved around from institution to institution for a number of years, but in 2008, the Institute agreed to host the lecture and has been doing so ever since. So it's a very great pleasure to welcome you here. Thank you for coming. And I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Rob Canton, who's chair of the steering committee, to introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lorraine. And I think although thanks will come at the end, I want to thank the Institute right at the very beginning, because without your continuing support, it would have been very hard to sustain the lecture series. Just to add to something that Lorraine said, this is the first year where we've formally advertised that we're doing the event in association with the Probation Institute. But it's also the first year that we've actually put the word probation in the title of the lecture. It did occur to the steering group only 26 years too late. It wouldn't be a bad idea to tell people roughly what they might expect to find being talked about when they came along to the lecture. Lorraine's already spoken eloquently about Bill's enormous contribution to probation research and scholarship, and the importance of cultivating a research culture and professional curiosity among practitioners, so that these are critical and reflective folk. Bill also was not only keen to find out what works, but also to insist why it matters and what's important about probation. So anyway, it's lovely to see everybody, and it's great for you all to come. And I hope that no one will feel offended if I particularly pick out for the warmest of welcomes people from the London Metropolitan University. Will Hughes has encouraged people to come and has significantly lowered the average age of the audience. And perhaps I could say that that's all for the good, because we do need some refreshment as we get a little bit longer in the tooth. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker this afternoon, our principal speaker. We'll have a principal speaker and then two respondents. And the principal speaker, the giver of the 26th Bill McWilliams Memorial Probation Lecture, is Helen Schofield. Helen has extensive experience in a number of different roles in the criminal justice sector. She was a probation officer for a long time and then took up a leading role in NAPO. And that's where I first came across you, if I may say so, Helen. I used to go, I won't say exactly how long ago, but it was in the last millennium. I used to go to NAPO conferences and enjoy Helen's passion and clarity and concision, and thinking, I'm very proud to be a member of an organisation that has people like this who can explain so clearly and champion the cause on our behalf. And nobody much else was doing so at the time. Even organisations like ACOT barely existed and certainly weren't producing any kind of clout at that time. And probation, NAPO, I think, was at the cutting edge in developing professional practice. So thank you for that, Helen. Helen went on to establish the Community Justice National Training Organisation, where occupational standards for probation, victim support, community safety was introduced. For a while, we lost Helen's contribution because she went off and joined the police, didn't you? Working in the Police Improvement Agency in the College of Policing, but then returned in 2016, first as acting chief executive and now as chief executive of the Probation Institute. So Helen's worked across the range with a variety of public, voluntary, private sectors to enhance development across the justice sector. She believes passionately in ensuring that all practitioners are supported to act with professional integrity in bringing about change, managing risk, and respecting diversity, and knows that if staff are similarly impassioned, they will work all the better and deliver what the public expects of the probation service. So Helen, thank you for accepting our invitation. Please welcome Helen, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Am I close enough? Can you hear me? Can you hear me at the back? We used to say, yes, I'll speak up. Good. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Lorraine, also. And thank you both of you for your roles in relation to the Probation Institute. Lorraine is our current chair, and Rob is the patron of the Probation Institute. So we are doubly fortunate in having those two excellent people supporting the Probation Institute. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's a nice opportunity. I hope we're going to have an interesting conversation. I am going to talk about probation. It's in the title, Probation, a local collaborative venture. But actually, I'm not going to talk about probation a huge amount. I'm going to talk about quite a lot of things surrounding probation. I'm going to talk about what I'm going to call the near economy. You know, they talk about near cash economy, don't they? It's all the bits that aren't quite cash. But I'm going to talk about the other bits that surround probation increasingly today. And I'm going to work out how this goes, which we did earlier on. So I do think probation's been on a journey. I think it is on a journey. I think it's a long journey. I saw this quote from Timothy Galton Ash the other day. I like Timothy Galton Ash, who's writing about Ukraine, actually. It was an incredibly moving piece. But this was another contribution, I suppose, to what people say about learning from the past, which is never easy. But I like the idea about the interaction between deep structures and processes. But I also like the bit about contingency, collective will, and leadership. And perhaps we'll come back to those during the afternoon. You probably all remember the report in which Justin Russell, as the outgoing Chief Inspector, concluded that probation service is struggling 2023 and supervision not at the level it should be. And he suggested an independent review is necessary to consider moving probation back to local control. I was about as surprised as anyone to see the Chief Inspector making such a strong statement, and we will explore that quite a lot. But also pressing for change are a lot of friends of the probation service, and I list some of these here. By no means all. We'll come back and talk about some of these too. Certainly, I know that NAPO is pressing for change. The Centre for Justice Innovation has made a very interesting submission to the incoming government, whichever it may be, which is just about being published this week. Very interesting. So, it is a very interesting moment, and I'm sure most of you will have seen or heard about the House of Lords Justice Committee report in 2023, which made such a strong and powerful and cogent argument for increasing, strengthening and enhancing community sentences. Not a perfect document by any manner of means, but given, their where they were coming from, it's actually a really strong document and a good one to see. So that is a part of the journey. It's just worth reminding ourselves, isn't it, whenever we do anything like this, that the prison population just goes up. 32%, these are government statistics, 32% of the prison population at March 2024 had not committed an offence involving violence or drugs. There are other statistics available for that. Prison Reform Trust thinks it's 44%. Whatever it is, it's very high. And you could just ask yourself, I can do the math myself actually, you can take 32% of 87,000 and you get left with a much smaller number. Obviously, it's not quite as simple as nobody should be in prison who hasn't committed an offence of violence or a drug offence, and even those not necessarily. But it is an indicator towards a question that we should be asking much, much more loudly. Who is it that is contained within that statistic for 87, nearly 88,000 people? And one of the things we know to our shame is that 27% of them in 2022 were Black, Asian, or from minority ethnic groups. And that is outrageously too high. And we'll come back to that today too. Probation caseload seems to sit around 250,000, 250,000. But there are, again, as you know, there's 67,000 or so cases waiting for the Crown Court at the moment. I didn't expect to be here a week before a general election. When you first invited me to do this a few months ago, actually, we could have already had a general election by now, couldn't we? We could be talking in the era of a new government. But I certainly didn't expect to be quite so close. It is unexpected and it is very exciting, isn't it? So I thought two things I'd do first. One is just go back to the title and just think a little bit about what local and collaborative might mean. And I'm trying to look at local, kind of look in really. I'm not here suggesting this is what it looks and feels like from within. I want to think about what it looks like from without. So the community, whatever you want to call them, would have a much stronger sense that those who commit offences in our community are part of our community. They are our own children. They are our own children's children. They are part of us. And that the avoidance of many of those offences is within our communities and within our gift. I just shocked this morning listening to the statistic that 1 in 20 people leaves a restaurant without paying. Well, I've no doubt those 1 in 20 reach the crime statistics. Not all of them, perhaps some restaurants maybe don't bother, but of those who do, you do wonder whether that is potentially an offence that could be avoided by different approaches to customers in restaurants. So I won't read all of these out in depth, or we'll be here forever, but you would be much more aware of provision and services for rehabilitation and resettlement in and around your own communities. When I go to, I will admit now to being a member of the Labour Party, it's probably obvious as we go through the day, but anyway. But when I go to Labour Party meetings in Brighton, where I now live, people would sometimes talk about the rehabilitation of offenders in a meeting. They might not just talk about the kind of crimes that are to do with dirty streets or noisy adolescents. They actually might talk about rehabilitation in a meeting and ask the council what it's doing. They don't ask the council because it's not the council's job, of course. But local councils in a local structured world would have greater responsibility for resettlement, and you only need to point to housing as evidence of their not needing really to pay very much attention to people coming out of prison, for example. So we'd see practitioners much more engaged with local projects. We'd see local representation on open and transparent scrutiny arrangements. I could have written that sentence the other way around, actually. We'd see some scrutiny arrangements for a start, wouldn't we? And that would be very nice, because it has to be said that the only real scrutiny currently is the inspectorate. And that is not necessarily as independent as you might want it to be. So we'd have some scrutiny arrangements, and we'd have local representation on those scrutiny arrangements. And we would have some local structures which would include representation from Black minority ethnic groups, women's rights organisations, lesbian and gay groups, disability. And we would be looking at it, collaboration, much more active collaboration between agencies and between practitioners and the agencies. And we'd be looking probably at greater collaboration with service users. So that sense of this is a task between us, between the practitioner and the service user, I think in a collaborative world would be a lot stronger. So a lot to kind of move towards, perhaps. So interesting that this appeared last week, and the italics are mine actually in the second line, because I do think it's a bit strong to charge the probation service with keeping the public safe. I don't think it's solely the responsibility of the probation service. But these lines are in the Labour Party manifesto, and in the second paragraph, not only the mention of devolution, but also that Labour will construct a strategic review of probation governance, including considering the benefits of devolved models. Well, very exciting. What does it all mean? Let's see where we're going. I just did a quick tour of history, really, because you can't, as Timothy Garton said, look forward without looking back a little bit, can you? And again, this is not to dwell on, but there are one or two things important. There were one or two things important in the 80s. In fact, they're all important, weren't they? I think the birth and the extreme influence of the Association of Black Probation Officers was one of the most important and impressive developments of the 1980s. And it is a real tragedy that that organisation was not able to continue after and through the reorganisation. Many of you in this room will remember, you know, incredibly powerful presentations from the Association of Black Probation Officers in an absolutely fearless way. And they moved NAPO, and I think they moved the probation service a long way in the 1980s and 1990s. So, and I couldn't help the quote from Stan Cohen. Sorry about that, but Anne did say the other day, she said, make sure the definition of bad is a curious one, isn't it? So I'm moving on. So what happened? I suppose the Thatcher government happened. For me, a lot of what happened in the 1990s goes back to that tragic death of the little boy, Jamie Bulger, in 1993, and it has always felt to me like things were never the same again, really. Incredibly powerful and terribly sad. So Michael Howard happened, Prison Works happened. I remember going on question time with Michael Howard and having an incredibly difficult and dark conversation with him. And it was a dark time, wasn't it? But I also remember Graham Smith, who sometime during the 90s, building on this sense of what works and what doesn't work, and saying to the probation service, no, there isn't any evidence that what you're doing is making a difference to the crime rate. And I can remember him saying, nobody in the probation service ever gets out of bed to do anything other than good. So why isn't it working? And, you know, he was a great advocate, but actually what followed as a result of that, or upheaval around training, all that, and the introduction of accredited programs, in which people felt very much kind of put into a straitjacket, I think, at that point. Although there is a little light at the end there, isn't there? Because the Youth Justice Board and the Youth Offending Services were created in 1998, and we will, of course, come back to them. 2000s, much more recent history. I borrowed from Matt Tidmarsh, who's here today, this line about the narrowing of the scope of rehabilitation to the management of risk. And it does seem to me that once that those terminology shifts and the narrowing of the scope and the introduction of managerialism, which wasn't probation introduced, it's a function and a feature of the 1990s, isn't it? Managerialism, by which management becomes policies and people are responsible for policies and people putting those policies into place, which I think had not been as robust, as prevalent until this time. So it seemed to me there probably were quite short steps once you've packaged risk up. And it's not difficult to kind of marketize it then, is it? But there were some really important parallel developments in the form of desistance theory and the understanding of trauma-informed practice, all of which is very familiar to everyone in this audience, I'm sure, and we'll come back to, but just the sense of respecting and fostering agency and celebrating progress, and then the beginnings of the understanding, which I still think we're working with and still trying to fully understand the impact of trauma on individuals. And then, bang, 2014. Again, you know, I don't need to remind anybody here, but it was a flawed model from the start. And I think that with hindsight, you can also see that creating a single service that only had responsibility for high risk was unhelpful anyway, let's say. Glenys Stacey, we should all have a considerable debt of gratitude, I think, to Glenys Stacey, shouldn't we? Because she was, again, absolutely fearless in drawing attention to the real shortcomings. And she triggered the shift to unification. But I do want to say that one or two things may have got lost along the way. And one of those, and it hasn't got lost, fortunately, was the beginning of the community hubs. Engagement workers, people with lived experience, were employed by the CRCs as engagement workers. They could not be and cannot be employed by the National Probation Service as practitioners, but they could in the CRCs. There were some practitioners who I spoke to then and subsequently said they had never been as empowered in their professional lives as they were during their experience with the CRC. They were lucky. They were in great places. They were given opportunity. They were given their head. They were allowed to do. The women's centres were an interesting example of some of the really forward thinking. And we all know that the IT systems were temporarily a bit better. But here came unification. I kind of want to say that it was so welcome, wasn't it, to unify the service again. But maybe it was all a bit quick. And maybe it wasn't a perfect model. And maybe you can't just scoop everything up and put it in one place and say, now carry on and go back to where you were. And so probation is struggling with unification. There's no doubt, in an environment in which it would have been difficult to maintain a fully staffed workforce anyway. But in the unification environment, we do have very severe problems of low numbers, very high volume of work, complaints and criticisms running alongside about the probation services, lack of attention to diversity, the constraints of the civil service, just making it so difficult for people to publish anything, making it feel impossible to speak out at the moment, that, you know, whether it's on Next or whatever it is. And then the, I won't put the dead hand of one HMPPS, but it's a bit like that, isn't it? And I'm not convinced about the reset. I don't think anybody's convinced about the reset at the moment. And then we ran an event a couple of weeks ago talking about serious further offence reviews, and Martin Jones joined us and very helpfully reminded us, of course, that there are in the region of 300 serious offence reviews every year. But over the period from 2020 to 2024, we have inevitably focused on 3 very serious offences and the reviews. And when you look through that, you look at the recommendations, you look at the findings, they all point to the lack of experienced people, lack of time, lack of resources, lack of information getting to the court, lack of time and capacity to reflect and learn, and then inevitably mistakes in allocation and assessment. So at a moment like that, I found myself asking, where is the voice of probation? And I wasn't sure that I knew. There are voices, there's no doubt about it. But I don't think at the moment the probation service has a clear, strong voice. And I think this is a moment in which it really, really needs one. And some of those, if those voices were local, wouldn't that be nice? But people don't talk about it because people in communities tend to talk about the thing that they can influence, and the thing they feel they can influence is what their local council is responsible for. Huge engagement with the stuff that councils can do, no engagement with the stuff that the Ministry of Justice can do, and that's no surprise, is it? And I just asked the question there about, do we have a shared language for this? If we are going to move into, a time of change, are we sure that we are conversing in the same language? This slide moves us on completely, because here we are. I suppose one thing I do want to say about the post-unification moment is that transforming rehabilitation created a market economy of 22 community rehabilitation companies, etc. You close it down, you put it back into one, you don't get rid of the market economy. It survives. In fact, it's doing very well out there in different contexts, different ways. And I think really I want to talk next about that economy that is continuing. So that's the near cash bit, if you like, the near probation environment. And some of it is statutory and it's structured like this, like the New Futures Network and the Government Employability Innovation Fund, and the Employment Pathways into Justice. And it's really interesting stuff, this. I don't know how much you know about it, but hopefully quite a lot. It's a regional structure. There are regional leads. They are expensive people. They are driven out of the prison service. They are not driven out of the probation service. And their job is to go, to enable people to get back into work. The final bit of it, Prison Employment Pathway, is actually the opportunity finally for people with lived experience to come into the justice sector, but not as PSOs or as PQIPs, not as trainee probation officers, but there are posts opening up. So that's a little bit of a breakthrough, I think, and we should be grateful to quite a lot of people who've worked hard to make that happen. I just want to stay with this point about employment for a moment as well, because quietly in the margins, lots more employers, for all sorts of reasons, are employing people who have convictions. A lot of those are in those hospitality, construction, transport, retail, always were, but clearly increasing. And the more you look into it, the more you see. You don't hear very much about it, do you? Apart from James Timpson, of course, everybody's hero, who is very good. And there are some wonderful stories out there. You probably know something about Redemption Roasters, people who set up the coffee outlets all over London. You know, they were bold enough to go and set one up in the middle of Dulwich, for goodness sake, and it's brilliant. And Cracksit, the little company who mends the phone every time you drop it. I mean, there's just a super company. But I don't know how much that is making inroads into the people who have always struggled to get employment. There's a bit of a statistic, isn't there? 30% will walk straight back into a job, 30% will need help, and 30% will never get a job. Very broad. But I'd love to know how all of that affects the middle 30%, let alone the 30% who won't necessarily find it easy at all to get a job. So they're there. We can't look at the near economy without looking at, we can't look at the private sector without looking at electronic monitoring. And you'll know this statistic, you'll know that Serco have this contract from 2023 to the new current contract. There have been lots, haven't there? Can you keep up with them? But this is a 6-year contract, and G4S, the infrastructure contract. And then I look at the MOJ's electronic monitoring strategy. As I mentioned, probation. We've had this conversation before, I suspect, in different places. Certainly the Probation Institute has. And I think some of the reasons why probation doesn't get closely engaged with electronic monitoring are historic, they're deep-rooted. Some of it is a little bit ideological. Some of it is because it's been such a mess, frankly, and it doesn't get any better. But it is there, and it is not going away. It is in that very close near economy. And if you're looking at the future and how you're going to structure it, and what a new government coming in is going to be looking at, this is big money in the new world or the next world. As are the commissioned services, and some of you will have seen HMIP's recent recent report on commissioned services. In the target operating model in 2021 was a very good document, and there was some really good words about allowing probation practitioners to broker services early on when, in supervision rather than undertake those activities themselves. This year's inspection report reports that less than 50% of probation practitioners are satisfied with the current range of commissioned services. You have to ask why. And again, we could probably spend the whole 40 minutes talking about this one, couldn't we? Some of that is about poor match. Just commission is not the same as what turned out to be needed because the questions weren't asked, there wasn't a fit. Some of it is about the time it takes to make a referral. Some of it is just lack of local engagement. Some of it is possibly also about training in the voluntary sector. Some of it is about the confidence of the probation practitioner in the voluntary sector. But it is a real worry when you look at the amount of money that is going through this big commissioning juggernaut in the Ministry of Justice out to commission services run in some cases by the very same people who had their CRCs closed down 3 years ago, and in other cases, some other new big, a lot of these are quite big organisations. And my next slide brings us on to the smaller organisations, some of these in the independent voluntary sector, operating without government funding, without a penny from government. I just mentioned 3 or 4 that are spread across the country. Some of them have had a bit of government funding and decided they just couldn't face applying again. Some of them never even got near it because the burden of the application and the monitoring and so forth that you could have is just not worth a candle. But they're all out there too, and I only mentioned 4, but there is a very large, small voluntary sector world out there that is struggling, that is cap in hand to charities for grants, and is working every day with referrals from the probation service on the ground, and it's wrong, in my opinion. But then, interestingly, we come to the community hubs. Again, HMI have been interested in this recently. I'll come to their slide. CFO, the co-financing organisation currently, and this was one of those that slips and slides around. Who knows how many community hubs there were? I think at the moment there are 19 community hubs. They're co-production. They're offering access, direct access, engagement with all the public sector services that that individuals need, practical help, GP services when they're working well. They're run again by some of the familiar names from the CRC world, CTEC, the growth company has been big in this field, and so on. The one in Manchester is part of the devolved commissioning arrangements in Manchester. We'll come to look at that as well. And there's a very interesting one in Newham called Y2A, which we think we're still waiting for the evaluation of the Y2A hub, but it's an 18 to 25-year-old hub. And all the indications are that it's doing very well. And what's interesting, of course, about the 18 to 25-year-old, this is the transition period. These are the transition challenge, really. And we all know probably there is some talk at the moment of youth justice for services available to yachts being able to be carried over into the transition years 18 to 2023. So someone like the Newham Hub is particularly interesting, focusing on this critical age group. So keep an eye on community hubs. And HMI has been doing and has said in a recent inspection report about the interventions landscape that staff benefited from the co-location and multidisciplinary nature of the community hubs. And people on probation benefit from the relational strengths and the individualised approach. And HMI suggesting that an expansion of community hubs in more areas and catering for more diverse needs would be welcome, alongside a properly evaluated review. And just reminding us, which is nice to see HMI reminding us of things as important as this, really. About resistance, if you like. Quoting from Hazel Kemshall and Kieran McCartan, talking about the individual, interpersonal and societal engagement and the strengths-based, trauma-informed way. If you don't, not everybody, I'm sure you do, if you don't get a chance to read the HMI reports, there's some really good stuff in them at the moment. So I recommend them to you. Let's talk about problem-solving courts while we're trying to round things up a little bit here. Again, the evidence suggests. I had a conversation quite recently with Phil Bowen from the Centre for Justice Innovation, and they're doing a huge piece of work supporting and evaluating the problem-solving courts. This is another one. It's very difficult to keep up with where they are, how many there are. They keep opening and closing, and there are different types. At the moment, we think there are 4 intensive supervision courts as part of the drug strategy, and 3 in the Crown courts. And there are 2, we think there may be more, but 2 problem-solving courts in Birmingham and Manchester, and there are specialist domestic abuse courts which come and go a little bit. All of this seems to come and go. Pilot starts, pilots close down. if you were seriously looking at reform, you would absolutely want to make some decisions about the future of the problem-solving courts. Conceptually, this is really sound stuff, isn't it? In that you are having, you know, the court assisted, if you like, from the outset by the understanding of the problem and the people who can help to solve the problem. And this is what seems to be working. Probation is getting additional funding to support the problem-solving courts, the new intensive ones. And that too appears to be quite energising on the ground where it's happening. So just a quick mention, because again, in your near economy, certainly since TR, but before as well, there are increasing numbers of dedicated women's centres, most of which are linked into the justice system to a certain extent, some to a greater extent than others. And the one that New Charts runs is also a diversion scheme, and that takes me into another area in the near economy, if you like, which is community resolution and diversion. Now, diversion's been on the kind of on the agenda on and off forever. Community resolution, out-of-court disposals, again, coming and going, but recently quite a growth area, I think. Revolving Doors, who you'll know, a brilliant organisation, talk about designing a diversion-first approach for people who have committed non-violent or low-level offences, which is not that radical, actually, but it's an important concept. I joined the Restorative Justice Association just out of curiosity, and I'm now bombarded with invitations to become an accredited restorative justice practitioner and to attend trainings and to go to restorative eds, but they're all in the prisons. One or two are in the schools, but most of them are in the prisons. And except that some of this has been picked up by completely independent organisations, funded by the police and crime commissioners, one of whom is just a little organisation called Remedy. I don't know if anybody knows Remedy, but they seem to run restorative justice opportunities all across the country, funded by different PCCs. So you'd want to know a bit more about those, wouldn't you, if you were really looking at what local looks like, because they're out there. And they're doing, you know, potentially hugely important work, victim-focused work, and as are some of the women's centres, Brighton's Women's Centre, the Willow in Edinburgh, certainly, and Together Women in Sheffield, all running restorative approaches within the centre. And then we come to adult out-of-court disposals, which have just had a new lease of life breathed into them, I think, by government. And you may already have come across a thing called immediate justice. Well, if you're looking to see how close the PCCs can get to probation without actually picking up the job, immediate justice is looking a little bit like it. There are about 16 pilots of immediate justice. It's for low-level offences. It involves people, you know, an old story, isn't it, admitting that, yes, they did commit the offence. No process whatsoever. Not on your record, apparently. And then you're asked to undertake some benefit to the community. And if all goes well, you'll never hear from us again. And that is all funded by the police and crime commissioners. And all the active engagement is done by the local police. So, and then they are commissioning organisations in the community to do the work on their behalf for the immediate justice pilots. It's an interesting concept, isn't it? If there's no process, can there be immediate justice? Anyway, that's broadly my roundup, but it does bring you to this concept of devolution. And Greater Manchester, of course, does have a devolved arrangement with government and has 10 community-based hubs of their own and has its own dynamic commissioning framework, the responsibility through the services of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. It's a big authority. This is very interesting stuff. There are 10 mayors, of course, and 37 PCCs. And when we talk about devolution, in some people's minds, this is the direction of travel towards PCCs and towards mayoral authorities. MOPAC, of course, haven't waited for anybody to devolve anything. I think they just got on with it, didn't they, and started commissioning services through the London Corruption Fund. So there's a lot of London money spent on what MOPAC describe as crime prevention and reduction services. And then we come to Wales, and you will have seen, actually, the Gordon Brown report wasn't the first one. I think there was a Thomas Commission, 2019, looking at devolution in Wales, makes a strong recommendation for devolving probation first and fully devolving youth justice to Wales. And then the Gordon Brown report, which of course is all about UK devolution, also making strong recommendation to devolve justice and probation and youth justice to Wales. And I certainly think that this, if in 8 days' time we do have a Labour government, this one will be quite high on their agenda. And that, of course, triggers a much bigger conversation about devolution across the piece. So the devolution in Wales, if it happens, of course, and some of the Wales folk behind this are here today, is supported by the Professional Development Working Group on Devolution for devolution of probation in Wales. So this is not just a political conversation. This is a very serious political strategy led by some very committed people in Wales. And we published it recently in the Probation Quarterly. It's all there. So there's really interesting stuff to read about how they envisage the professional probation service going forward as a devolved arrangement. And so finally, we can look at youth justice with the possibility of how does this work? And of course, the way youth justice works is it incorporates central funding and a central strategic board, and then it devolves delivery on a multidisciplinary basis to multidisciplinary teams. And you'll know this, it's doing pretty well. Everything is not perfect. I listened into a youth justice conference on Monday, and you know, there's a lot of challenging going on within the youth justice arena, and they recognise that Black minority ethnic children are still overrepresented in youth custody. There are a lot of problems about youth custody itself, but in the community, the numbers, you know, the numbers of children going from the community into custody are very low, much lower than they have been for a very long time. It's recognised that risk isn't always prioritised as well, but the youth justice system is child-focused, it's trauma-informed, and it's very alert around neurodiversity. And it's a very interesting model to look at if you're reviewing where you're going with probation and taking that hinterland with you. So we're almost done. So I do think what we do now will be crucial. I don't think we can just drift along. If there's a serious conversation to be had about local and collaborative, a serious conversation to be had about devolving, you cannot just devolve the Unified Probation Service as it is and forget about the rest. That market is out there. It is not going away. Some of it is thriving and doing amazingly well. Some of it's a mess. But it has to all be seen as a piece of commitment. So this is the submission from the Centre for Justice Innovation to the new government that will go through. Probation work needs to be pushed back into a structure in which power and decision making are kept as close as possible to communities, most likely down to local authority level, akin to how community justice services are provided in youth justice. So you can see where the Centre for Justice Innovation, which is very close to government actually, what they are suggesting at the moment as a model. So the question, I think this is my final slide, is how do we evaluate and how would we organise that extensive range of initiatives, projects and services together towards rehabilitation and resettlement and crime reduction and restoration, where would we put the statutory service in a restructuring moment? What is the, I mean, we know what the role of the probation officer is, but actually in communities, is it something a little bit like GP practices? How autonomous, how independent, how well qualified, how professional is this service? Is it, you know, is it on a par with the GP practices and the commissioning and if you like, look more like consultancy than the running around job? I don't know, consultancy with a small c, not a money grabbing consultancy. My final question then goes right back to Timothy Garth-Nash, who talked about contingency, collective leadership, courage, and I've added sensitivity, of course. Contingency is there. A new government, a crisis, and an enormous powerhouse of energy to be understood and worked with. This is not just about reshaping the probation service. It's a fabulous challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, for such a stimulating and provocative lecture. And I'm sure that there'll be people here and online who are just itching to ask you questions. But I'm asking them to restrain and to keep their questions in their heads for a moment, because first we want to hear from two respondents, the first of whom is Katie Lawrence. Now, Katie has worked in the probation service, worked in criminal justice since 2005, when she became a trainee probation officer, qualifying in 2007, and went on to specialise in working with women and also with people with a diagnosis of personality disorder. Since 2008, she's been active in NAPO and has held various roles at branch level. In 2012, joined the MEC. So Katie was in an important position in NAPO at that complex and demanding time of transforming rehabilitation, and will have had insights into that whole process that not many of us will have been able to achieve. In 2014, she was elected National Vice Chair and served in that role for 4 years before becoming the National Chair in 2018. And again, served the union through the unification process as well, another demanding experience. After the end of her term of office at NAPO, Katie moved to work in the probation workforce programme and is now in policy lead in the workforce planning system. And it did occur to me that in St. Helen, Katie is a recent holder of the baton that you used to carry in earlier years in NAPO, urging the importance of the workforce as you consider the qualities needed for probation to fulfil its mission. The workforce is essential to that debate, and both of you have made fabulous contributions to it. So Katie, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Helen, for taking us through time and space on a journey around probation. And in fact, because the only thing that is constant in probation is change, my role has actually changed since I sent my bio to Rob. And as part of the reorganisation of HMPPS, I now work in the Transforming Delivery Directorate. I'm still doing the same job, which is looking at people, and people are in fact my favourite topic. People are what brought me into the probation service in the first place. People are what kept me in the probation service. And now I look at probation people, the people who work with the people who need us most. One of the things that Helen encouraged us to think about was the community. How is probation linked to community? And when I was considering that and thinking about how do I connect with that idea? How do I think about probation people and community? And I realised I was thinking about it the wrong way, because probation people, the staff who deliver probation services, are part of the community. They're not mutually exclusive things. It is definitely the case that the staff profile in most probation areas don't fully represent the communities that they serve. but they are definitely part of those communities. And indeed, one of the most important things about probation is that probation becomes a community. And as I look out at so many friendly, familiar faces, it reminds me of all of the people that I've encountered on my journey through probation, and all of the people who've become friends, supporters, people who I have disagreed with, people who I've argued with, but people who I have learned from, because every single person that I encounter in my life, I learn from. But do probation staff see themselves as part of their community? I think that's a really important question that we need to answer. And I can look at the people assembled in this room and see some excellent people to answer that question. Are the places in which we deliver probation services visible in their communities? I spoke to somebody just yesterday who was saying how impressed they were at how subtle the signage is at their local probation office. And that really made me think. It really made me think about how many people know that there is a probation office, a probation place, a probation service in that road. How many people know that? We will probably know because we've probably been there. The people who use probation services will know. Some landlords will know because they refuse to rent to the probation service. But do people generally in that community know that probation are there and what probation are there for? Should they know? Should they know that there is a service that is supporting people and serving the community? Well, I think they should. And I think we really need to think about that. And Will and I was just talking earlier about some of the research that's been done into probation places and what they mean and how they function and how they help and support or not the work that probation does. And I think that we should think more about probation places, and we should think about how we use them and how we advertise them or not advertise them, and how connected they are to the community. And the community hubs are an excellent example of what happens when we don't hide ourselves away, of what happens when we actually go out and say, hey, we're here, we're doing some good stuff, and we'd like to do it with other people. So my role at the moment is all about people as the greatest resource that the probation service has. It's all about making sure we've got the right people doing the right thing in the right place at the right time. And I do a lot of counting. I do a lot of counting of what the things are that we're asking probation staff to do. I do a lot of counting of how many people on probation need those things. And that might not sound that exciting. And sometimes when I'm in the midst of 100 spreadsheets, I might not feel it's very exciting, but it's really, really important, because without doing that kind of work, we don't have probation staff, we don't have probation trainees, we don't have probation officers, we don't have PSOs, we don't have people who are doing excellent work in their communities, or at least we don't have enough of them. And I had the pleasure of a guided tour through Cambridge from Will earlier with some of his students, and was talking to somebody who is a probation officer who was talking about how difficult staffing is in their office. And it is absolutely crucial that we make sure we've got the right people doing the right thing in the right place at the right time. So what is the right thing for them to do? That's important too. When I trained as a probation officer, I learned so many things from so many people. Sometimes I learned what not to do. Sometimes I learned things that I didn't really understand at the time, but made much more sense to me later. I learned all the way through my career, and I'm still learning. One of the things that I learned that I didn't really understand at the time, but I understood it later, was trauma-informed practice. I didn't, at the time I learned it, I didn't understand it in those terms. I didn't use those words. Nobody around me used those words. But they did talk to me about seeing the communication behind the behaviour, about not responding to what's in front of you, but seeking to look past it and understand the person. And doing that, I got back to people. And later, much later in my career, I had the fabulous opportunity to do some study around working with people with the diagnosis of personality disorder. And then I understood the term trauma-informed practice. And my work in a women's centre, I was one of the first probation officers to go and work wholly in a women's centre. I went out of the probation office, hidden with its discreet signage. I went into the women's centre and I supervised women, often while having a child sitting on my knee, while making tea and toast in the kitchen. And I supervised women while walking around the local park. And I was able to do that because I understood trauma-informed practice. I didn't know the words for it, but I understood it. And I was able to do it because in my area, they said, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to focus on the people. And one of the things I learned when I did that was that it mattered that I was a woman from the same place as the women in the women's centre. That representation mattered to them. It made a difference. We were able to share an experience that moved us forward. And we're back again to people, to the people in probation. But we're hopelessly not representative of the people that we serve. If you look at any group of probation staff gathered in an office, you will see majority women, whereas obviously the people that we work with in probation are majority men. You'll see the majority of people who come from a background where they went to university straight after doing A-levels. You'll see a majority of people who have not experienced the criminal justice system, or if they have, only in a very minor way. And that is not reflective in any way, shape or form of the people that we work with. And we have to do better. And we are striving to do better, and we are opening up qualification routes to make sure that people can come into probation from different backgrounds, that you're not restricted from applying for probation if you don't have a degree, that you're not restricted from applying to probation if you don't come from a background where the first thing you did at 18 was go to university. We've got a very, very long way to go, but doing the work that we are doing should help us get there. But one of the problems in probation was summed up for me in a discussion with a colleague who talked about sediment building up over time in the probation service. And I thought that was an excellent way to describe what happens over time. And Helen has talked about a lot of different reports and reviews and research that have made a difference to what we do in probation. But some of what happens in response to those reports, reviews and research is sediment. It's things that build up over time, and we're not really quite sure why we do it that way, but we just do. And maybe we can point back to a horrendous and tragic case, and the learning from that case was we've got to do this particular thing in this very particular way, but no one's quite sure if it actually makes a difference. And I think that some of the things, some of the sediment that exists in the system now is akin to some of the thinking, some of the awakenings that happened in the 80s and the 90s. And we've got to really, really interrogate what we are doing. And we've got to find the sediment and we've got to chuck it out so that we can focus on the core work. And the core work is people working with people. And a big part of that work is thinking. And Helen talked about space for reflection, space for thinking, which often doesn't exist because the sediment gets in the way. And the time that you would have spent thinking, reflecting, challenging yourself is taken up with wading through layers and layers of sediment and doing things that nobody can quite remember why we do it that way. And I think I always ask myself, and perhaps it's because I joined probation in 2005, what does actually work? And we know some things that actually work, but the main thing that actually works in supporting people to move away from offending is a positive working relationship with a worker that cares what happens to you. That's what works. The sediment can be washed away and we can be left at the centre with a person and another person working together to try and make a change. And I really hope, that where we're heading in the future will take us closer to that, will help us to wash away some of that sediment, to get rid of the things that built up over time, often for very good reason at the time, but serve no purpose now. And we can get back to all of it being about people. And it's not just because it's my favourite topic, but it's because everybody in this room is here because of an innate belief in people. Thank you.
Katie, thank you very much. And again, I'm sure that you will have made people want to ask you lots of questions, not to stretch the metaphor about whether the sediment should be thrown away or whether there's scope for sifting it, aerating it and turning it somehow into more fertile soil. But you've reminded us at the end of some of the reasons why many of us wanted to work in probation in the first place and given us a different take than the one that Helen gave us on this concept of community and how that fits in with the work of probation. Enough of me, because I'm now to introduce our second respondent, Will Hughes. Now, Will joined the probation service in 2000 as a PSO in Torquay and worked as a PSO in London before training in the fourth cohort. That was 2001, is that right, Will? 2002. When he, at that time, was a trainee probation officer in Hertfordshire. And that's when Will and I first met, because he undertook his studies at the Montfort University, where I was working at that time. And Will continued to work in Hertfordshire after qualification, first as a probation officer, and then as a practice teacher, or as a practice development assessor, as they were then known. In 2012, he left probation as a permanent member of staff to take up a post as lecturer at the London Metropolitan University in the Department of Criminology. And this is why I mentioned earlier that he has since that time championed the cause of this lecture in that department. So 4 cheers for Will. But he also continued to deliver probation domestic abuse perpetrator programs and group-based interventions in the voluntary sector. His most recent publication, Working with Violent Men, is a monograph based on his PhD thesis, which explores the background, delivery and gender dynamics of probation perpetrator programs. Now, I haven't read that, but I have read Will's thesis more thoroughly than many people would have read it, because I examined it, and a very good thesis it was too. Katie is a newer friend, Will is an older friend, and it's very good of you to accept the invitation to respond. And over to you, Will. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to, there's a reason why I bring my students to come provide. I don't go places without an enthusiastic audience. I am about to mark their work as well, so that might have affected. Actually, I'm not. It's very hard to say something new when it's always kind of more reassuring if you're following people who've been kind of indecipherable and cantankerous. But when you're following people who've made very innovative, creative, and insightful comments. It's hard to kind of follow up other than saying I agree, really. So I suppose I want to go a bit further. One of the things I think both Katie and Helen spoke about, which is I'm really interested to hear, is they're reigniting some very old conversations in criminology. Some things that perhaps we haven't been sensitive to for a long time, or certainly not sensitive in the way that we should. So words like community. We've heard various governments talk about and emphasise the role of community, often as a way of removing state responsibility for undertaking work. It's been a way of saying, well, we can cut back on state spending. We can let the community do it. The big society was the phrase, I think, that David Cameron used. What the big society was, no one quite knew, but they were going to do all the work that the public sector wasn't going to do anymore. But that said, community does have a really important role. I'm actually recognising this is a very long-standing issue. And as I say, I'm quite, being a frontline practitioner is quite a long way away from me now, but I teach a lot of theory, criminological theory. And I'm reminded of a key thinker who was writing in the US in the first part of the 21st century, a man by the name of Ezra Park. Now, Ezra Park worked at Chicago University, kind of in the 1930s, or we might have the dates slightly wrong, and he had lots of students who were eager to ask him questions. What do we do about crime? Why do people commit crime? How is our government supposed to respond? Which book should I read, Professor Park? And Ezra Park's response is still one that I encourage students to think about. He said, well, for starters, you shouldn't be in this lecture room. You shouldn't be listening to me. You shouldn't actually be in the library. This is still quite a radical thing, a lecturer saying, don't go to the library, don't be in lectures. We tend to say the opposite at London Met, but so kind of let that go over you. He said the way to understand and address people's problems is to immerse yourselves in the worlds in which they live. So to quote him, he'd say, go to the bars, go to the homeless shelters, hang out on the streets, meet people, make sure that people know you. And one of the things that he suggested was key, and he said the students would find this as well, was what he referred to as distance. If you go into a community, you recognise that there's a distance between the people living in communities who are experiencing social problems and the professional agencies like probation officers who are there to support them, or any kind of professional volunteer organisations. There's a disconnect. And I think that's what we've seen over certainly my career as a probation officer. So I used to keep this quiet, and at risk of embarrassing him, I showed the remarkable lack of imagination in my career choice as much as anything else. But my father was also a probation officer. So I've kind of seen probation over several generations now. So growing up with a father as a probation officer would often involve, wherever we went, my father would start chatting to someone who, I think he wasn't supposed to tell me, but it was someone who was evidently on the books, in the local toy shop, in the local cafe, and that was a probation officer's world. A bit like Ezra Park was with his students and his research, the probation officer's job was one where he or she was immersed in the local community. They knew not just the offender, but the offender's family as well, other social networks. So that changed significantly from when my father was a probation officer to when I was, to when increasingly, or almost exclusively, you might do a home visit during the course of knowing someone, but generally, you wouldn't see the person in the space of their own home. You'd see them in a sanitised room. Katie was talking about the importance of physical space, the kind of environments in which we see people. So we see people in a particular version of themselves. We see them in a space where they are an offender. Helen talked about resistance, this idea of what is it that draws people away from offending. And part of resistance is actually encouraging the non-offending parts of people's identities. So we don't just see them as an offender, we see them as a son, a brother, a worker, someone who's got key personal skills. We're far more likely to see those qualities if we see people in the communities in which they live. So to carry on with the analogy, I mean, I think the point for me when I thought, well, actually, this is a service that I'm not sure I can really feel at ease with. I mean, it certainly didn't involve, I mean, another thing that, my father did as well is, you take groups of offenders off on horse riding. Sorry, Dad, you might have to take groups of offenders off on horse riding trips. If you want to get the rehabilitative experience in its fullest, you'd have to bring your children with you as well, or camping trips. Off camping, again, you take your children to that as well. So for people of our generation, the idea of taking a group of offenders camping and taking your family members seems somewhat divorced from, seems to be I think I remember a bit sitting in just to kind of finish the trajectory. I remember sitting in a team meeting, and there was a trainee probation officer who's just about to qualify. And she'd worked over the entire period of her training with one person. And she put up her hand in the team meeting and said, I've got a really radical idea. Here. I know, don't call me stupid for this, but I want to show this offender, as the language was then, I think it still is. No? The offender, we told you must call them offenders when I joined the service. In fact, don't let anyone hear you call them clients. The clients of the courts. These people are offenders and they need to be reminded of that. But this student said, I've got a really radical idea. I want to communicate to this person that I've been supervising that I don't just see them as a risk. I don't just see them as someone with whom I have a relationship that's just based on sitting in a probation room. For the final meeting, I want to actually take them for a coffee, have my last supervision session with them where I buy them a cup of coffee and I can sit with them in a neutral environment where we're just two people. I was thinking, this sounds really, this is the kind of thing we're supposed to be doing. The response from the senior was, this is a totally unethical thing to do. This is not something that's at all suitable. We shouldn't be building relationships with the people that we supervise outside of the immediate rooms that we have. So it's these kind of dilemmas. Actually, we do need to re-establish that sense of community, the links that people have. And this raises a whole other set of dilemmas about, I think as Helen was saying, professionalism. And what does professionalism mean? I think that we've got a colleague of ours at London Met who's recently written a paper talking about how the professionalisation of some communities has just led to the fragmentation of informal sources of support. So people who used to provide, the people who've been in the community for a long time, they tend to withdraw once professional agencies get involved. So it's that, well, certainly his argument anyways, that, and actually the risk has increased, the level of crime has gone up because the community members don't trust professional agencies like they do long-standing members of the community. Recognising there's complexity here because probation officers are members of the community quite often. So, to sum up, I think those are the key issues. I'm not saying anything that Katie haven't already said. How do we utilise this sense of community, these bonds or these links between community members themselves, between probation staff and the lives that people live, the people that they're supervising? And perhaps most importantly, I think we've talked certainly in the past about the very, and Chanel, my former excellent student who Katie was referencing, who's currently a probation officer. And I think Gwen Robinson, who did the speech a couple of years ago, was saying, the average expectancy of a probation officer is now something like 2 years before I might not be quoting you, I make up these figures and then hopefully someone confirms, but it's very short. So again, we've talked about relationships. I think certainly even when I was a probation officer, which is some time ago now, most of the people we were supervising had far more experience of probation than many of the staff did, which, again, that sense of turnover, how the relationships build. As a final comment, I think I just add that this kind of creative thinking that we've heard today about reflexivity, about building relationships, we can't really do much with that, with the kind of caseloads and the kind of pressures that frontline staff are under. Not just the quantity, but also the nature of it. I think probation staff are it's an anxiety-provoking experience. It's a constant sense of having to be held to account for someone else's life. It's not something where you're making eye contact with Sinead here. It's not something where you go into work thinking, I can really engage with this person. It's a sense of, how do I cover myself? How do I make sure that I've done all the bits of bureaucracy to show that what I should have done to make sure that I'm covered if something goes wrong? That kind of ethos in probation significantly undermines, I think, the kind of work that I think all three of us are interested in. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I'm now going to ask Professor Lol Burke to give the final talk of this afternoon. Lol is a professor at Liverpool John Moores University, last year's McWilliams lecturer, and a valued member of our steering group. He has written, not least with Steve Collett, who's sitting right in front of me as well, on probation and governance in recent years, and has even more recently been undertaking some work with other excellent scholars, one of whom, Gwen Robinson, is here, on what all the reconstruction, deconstruction, and all of this has actually meant for those undertaking the work. Lol is going to talk very briefly to come up with what he thinks are our takeaway points from the discussion.
It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to provide a personal reflection on Helen's lecture and responses from Katie and Will today. I have to say I do so with a great sense of apprehension. This task was done for many years by Mike Nellis and did it so expertly that I'm not even going to attempt to fill those shoes. The themes emerging from this year's lecture are both enduring, and in this respect reflect the spirit of Bill McWilliams' work, but they're also timely, as has been mentioned throughout the afternoon, given that we are in the throes of a general election, which, if the polls are correct, is pointing to a change of government. It perhaps goes without saying that whoever forms the next government faces considerable challenges within the justice sector, resulting from years of under-resourcing, ideologically driven neoliberal policymaking, and muddled thinking, as Helen so deftly outlined in her lecture. I was fortunate in that I was given the opportunity to see Helen's slides before the event today, so I could prepare for it. And then just as I was about to walk into the room, Rob said, "Oh, Helen's changed the slides." And I was reminded of a story, and Steve will know this, from Liverpool court, where the judge said, "Excuse me, is there a probation officer in the room?" The officer stood up, and the judge said, "This report you've given me, it's not on the right person. It's not on the defendant in the dock." And the probation officer allegedly replied, "Well, I'm sorry, Your Honour, but it's the only one I've got." Well, this is the only one I've got, so bear with me. Helen asked the question, how will the new government respond to this challenge? Well, personally, I see little within the manifestos of the main political parties that reflects the leadership, courage and sensitivity that Helen rightly suggests is needed to bring about the changes required. Instead, there appears to be a continued reliance on short-term measures, such as increasing the number of prison places available, in a forlorn attempt to try and build our way out of prisons. The prison crisis, I should say. Helen also asked, how should we evaluate and organise the extensive range of provision available? And I have to say, the academic in me completely misread this and misinterpreted it. I thought Helen was talking about evaluation. And I think, as Katie alluded to, I think, in many ways, we are in a stronger position and have a greater understanding of the evidence base for what constitutes effective probation practice than ever before, I would argue. But the problem is that real and sustained change is in many cases a long-term aspiration that doesn't fit neatly within short-term political needs to demonstrate quick wins. As Rob has recently so astutely written, the pathway out of offending should not be assumed to be a simple reversal of the route in. At the very least, in my opinion, probation should not compound the processes of desistance through overzealous recall practices and the imposition of burdensome requirements that impede rather than support desistance. And I'm with Will on this one, that for me, the political courage that Helen refers to should also include a more honest and transparent dialogue about the boundaries and limitations of probation's work, particularly in relation to its public protection role. Probation work is a complex endeavour that requires time and resources, and in some cases, inevitably failure. It involves holding balance between care and control. However, whilst being acutely aware and accepting their public protection role, many of the newly qualified practitioners that myself and Gwen in our study interviewed described the relentless and unfulfilling nature of the contemporary case management practices that in turn restricted the scope of probation work to predominantly one of merely enforcement and monitoring. The emotional costs of living with the constant fear of the commission of a serious further offence by a person under their supervision, and the heightened level of scrutiny and recrimination that inevitably ensued, led some to view the case management function, which was once the absolute core task of probation, as merely a rite of passage to be endured before taking on a more specialised and what they perceive to be a less pressurised role, or in some cases pursuing alternative employment in an organisation where they believe they would be able to exercise greater discretion and innovation. Few, I think, would argue with Helen's contention that a highly qualified and formally recognised professional workforce is the key to a better future for probation. Current recruitment practices in probation, though, are perhaps a good example of where overly centralised procedures do not best serve local needs. Effective supervision is achieved through a mixture of personal qualities and skills, because all the research suggests that skilled workers produce better outcomes. It's important, therefore, that the organisation not only recruits the right people, but it also keeps them. Helen also asked the question of where should we locate statutory services? Well, as Helen indicated, the Labour Party has said that if they form next government, they will reconsider the current arrangements for the governance of probation. And so the title of Helen's lecture, Probation, a Local Collaborative Venture, could not be more apt. I suspect that most people in this room would endorse Helen's call for probation to be an independent governmental body delivered along more localised lines. Steve Collett and myself have consistently argued, though, that there's a need for both a strong centre and a strong local, somewhat akin to the approach adopted by the then newly formed probation service in 2001. By this, we meant that there was a need for both a highly strategic national focus alongside the need to locate delivery mechanisms within the local government and local communities. Of course, I accept, I'm sure Steve would as well, that such an approach is potentially fraught with tensions, but I would argue that these tensions can lead to positive and creative outcomes if they are approached in the spirit of mutual respect and a shared vision for the organisation, rather than tribalism and rigid command and control structures, whose main function seems to be to respond to the whims of politicians, rather than the needs of those individuals on probation or the communities in which the organisation operates. However, whether this can be achieved within the current structures, I think, is highly debatable. Certainly, many probation practitioners I've spoken to over the past couple of years have expressed their frustrations with the current structures, which they feel have stifled innovative practice and the flexibility to provide local solutions to local problems. Helen helpfully provides a range of approaches, such as community hubs, women's centres, problem-solving courts, utilising lived experience, which could and should be developed to building a more locally and responsive organisation. And alongside this, I would suggest that rebuilding probation by forefronting reparation, restoration and rehabilitation in its broader sense as public goods in their own right, rather than mere servants of a public protection agenda that can sometimes set up unrealistic expectations with the inevitable sense of being let down by the next serious further offence committed. Finally, earlier this week, I attended a workshop that involved academics, practitioners, and those with lived experience considering the question, What is probation? This is a theme that's emerged through our research, and the constant organisational changes appear to have muddied the waters in terms of what the purposes of probation are. Perhaps a new government could begin by setting up a commission, like the Morrison Commission in the 1960s, to explore this. And I think the questions raised by Helen today and Will and Katie would be an excellent place to start their inquiries. So thank you to Helen, Katie and Will for an extremely thought-provoking event. I know if Will McWilliams is here today, he will be absolutely delighted with the quality of the contributions. And I think he'd probably be the first one to raise his hand up and ask lots of questions because of the thought-provoking way in which you've approached the task. Thank you very much.
Thank as well. Before I do, I have to, the risk of embarrassing myself, share a little daydream that I had earlier in the day. And the daydream was a little bit like this, that Mr. Sunak got in touch with me a couple of weeks ago, and he said, I understand that the McWilliams lecture is taking place. And I know, as Prime Minister, that when people come to the booth and they are poised, ready to make their mark to vote, the governance of probation will be at the forefront of their minds. So how can the electorate take full advantage of the dealings of the McWilliams? And I said, well, if I were you, I'd have the election not too long after the date of McWilliams, which I gave him. And then the daydream continued, because then somebody got in touch from the Conservative Party and said, is it right that the election is going to take place on the 4th of July? And I said, well, I wouldn't bet on it. I mean, I really shouldn't bet on it. One of the great things, a privilege, it's an honour to be in part of this lovely steering group and to be associated with this tremendous lecture series. But one of the things that I most like doing is to thank people whose I admire and respect so much. And I want to thank our speakers again, if I may, on your behalf. Helen, above all, as our principal lecturer, because without the stimulating questions that you put, the respondents wouldn't have been able to respond with their eloquence, and none of the discussion would have followed. So a warm thanks to all three of you, and perhaps I can invite applause for them at this point. But you'll all know that, as well as the people who stand at the front, there are people who are less visible, less apparent, without whom a lecture like this couldn't possibly take place. So among the people that I would need to thank at this point are Paul, who's the IT person, who's made sure that that all works smoothly, and that's quite challenging in a number of ways. Rebecca, who has now left the Institute, but did a lot of work in the build-up this year and a lot of work in the past. And Katie and Anna, who've done a tremendous amount to make sure that this year's lecture also works. Now, Jane Dominy very kindly put together this thank you list for me, but inexplicably omitted the name of Jane Dominy. Because Jane does an enormous amount in preparation for the lecture and has been juggling at least 6 or 7 different tasks from the front this morning, this afternoon, all very invisibly, but much appreciated, Jane. We couldn't do this without you. I don't know if, Jane, as a final request, there's a slide that you can put up at this point. And there's a leaflet going around, and this is the text of the leaflet. Some of you will have found this on your chairs. The McWilliams Committee, in the past, people have wanted to support the lecture series by making a financial donation. And if that's something you would like to do, donations can be made online through BACS and so on. And the details of that are on the board and also here. But also there will be cash collected here today if anyone is in a position to make that donation. And Gwyneth Boswell and perhaps another will be there with their buckets. So you'll have to work your way around Gwyneth if you want to get out. But we know that not everybody carries cash, so that's understood. But so that's it. Thank you very, very much again for coming. Thanks to everybody. See you all next year. Safe journeys back.
Yes.